Righto, so let's look at the nature, character and spatial distribution of megacities in the developing world. And it's those last two words which are key. So when we look at megacities, the main difference between a megacity and a world city is that a megacity's criteria is simply its population. Does it have more than 10 million people? So 10 million people and 8 million people, you might hear these two figures quite often. Essentially, our syllabus is that old that the UN, since the publication of our syllabus, have said that a megacity is a city or a large urban agglomeration with more than 10 million people. But if you use the syllabus definition of 8 million people, then you're fine. You're not going to get marked down for that. So let's have a look at this. So to successfully address this dot point, you need to be able to do the following. So essentially, what are megacities? Describing their nature. What are some of the characteristics and where are they located? So being able to identify them on a map, describe their spatial distribution, so are they in the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, what continents or regions. So let's look at the syllabus definition. So this was obviously around the time period of 2000, we're in 2016, so where you can refer to specific information regarding up-to-date stats and that type of thing, it'll look better in your exam and obviously your assessments as well. Now, so let's have a look at the UN definition. So as I said before, it's a large urban agglomeration or metropolitan area with a total population of 10 or more million people. So it can be a single metropolitan area or two, as long as they're sharing the same sort of urban area. But for us, like I said before, it comes back to developing world. We're interested not in the megacities of the developed world, for example, Japan, which is obviously a developed nation, and Tokyo, the largest city in the world, is Japan is a developed nation. So for us, we're not all that interested in looking at Tokyo. So what's the definition between developed and developing? Well, as you can see on the screen here, there's no real black and white definition. So I guess it comes down to history. When we think about history and what's common in academia and what's out there in terms of development, we typically think of Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and some other regions. For example, I mentioned before Japan, as developed. They're highly developed. And when we compare this to, say, some of your more notably less developed countries, ones that struggle with health, education, literacy, providing those basic services, we can see that our developed countries are far beyond our less economically developed countries. So as you can see there's some that are on the border, but it's pretty clear. And if we go back to those syllabus definitions and those examples, we've got many, many cities to study, and obviously lots of challenges within those cities, which obviously is our next dot point. So let's have a look at this. So we've got a compound column graph with 3 years here, so 1990, 2014 and 2030. So this is looking at global urban population growth as is propelled by the growth of cities of all sizes. So urbanisation is continuing to be a dominant trend globally. We're seeing people move from rural areas to urban areas because of those pull factors. What's attracting them to cities? So better employment opportunities, better education opportunities. Essentially, living in rural areas, there's not much there for people any longer. You've got large businesses overtaking agriculture. You've got towns that are diminishing in size. It's just more affordable and better to live in a city, whether you're in a developed country or a developing country. Now you might say, what about the slums? What about those poor living conditions in which people live? And yes, I truly agree that it's terrible living conditions. But are there more opportunities in urban areas overall? Certainly. So let's have a look at this graph in relation to megacities. So in 1990 we had 10 cities, over 10 million people. And if we move back 50 years before that, we're only looking at a handful number of megacities. So megacities that are over that 10 million mark. We can also see 2014, 28 cities. And it's projected to be 41 cities. by 2030. And where is this growth occurring? Where are we seeing the rise of the megacities? Well, it certainly isn't developed countries. What we're seeing in developed countries are a slowing in the fertility rates. People are having less children, becoming more wealthy, more career-orientated, career-focused. So our cities in the developed world, yes, they're growing, but not at the rate at which cities of the developing world are growing. So here we've got a world map looking at some of these large cities. Cities of all sizes. The ones we're interested in, of course, are these red circles. So we can see that our red circles occur in various areas around the globe, most notably not Australia. When we think about the size of Australia's cities, yes, they seem big to us here, but when we compare that to some of your Asian, South American, and European cities, they're no comparison. These cities, for example, in Asia have a much higher population density, and some cities with far greater population sizes than, say, Sydney are in a much smaller space. But again, we need to focus in on the developed world and take them out of the equation. So when we look at the red dots of Los Angeles, New York City, they're examples that we're not interested in. Whereas we're more interested in these examples of Central and South America. Mexico City, very large urban city and urban agglomeration, and it's in a developing country. Sao Paulo is another example. When we move across to Africa, we have Lagos and Kinshasa, we have Cairo in Egypt, we have Manila in the Philippines. We have various examples within our developing countries. Dhaka in Bangladesh, which we'll have a look at in a minute. And of course, India. India is going to be the most populated country globally. It's going to overtake China in the next not too distant future. And of course, we can see that China dominates with many megacities. Okay, so let's look at the 10 top megacities. So this, of course, includes developed countries. So we have Tokyo at the top. We can see that since 1990 we've seen some steady growth, and then we're seeing it flatten off after 2015. The one city that exhibits the most amount of growth is Delhi. So Delhi, at around about 1990, had a population of about 10 million people. By 2030, it's expected to have near to 35 million people, 35 million inhabitants. We've got Mumbai, also in India, which is expected to grow, Sao Paulo, Mexico City. So this map, really useful, can give you an idea of some of the trends of growth. We can see that New York is expected to slow, and really isn't going to be that much bigger than it was in 1990. Okay, so I've taken some dot points from the World Urbanisation Prospects, UN publication that they published in 2014. So you can have a look through here. So these cities, obviously not as dominant economically or culturally as your world cities, they still play a role in the globalisation process. Not at the upper hierarchy levels where they are dominant, make the decisions. Rather, these cities are the basis of manufacturing typically. So where does our stuff come from? Where is it manufactured? It's manufactured in our developing countries typically because of the low production costs, and the cities within these developing countries are manufacturing hubs. Okay, so this is a really good interactive produced by Guardian. We can see the growth of cities. It's looking at where they are. Really useful resource that I recommend you have a look at in your own time. But it also points out here, indicated by this figure, that these are centres of growth, and for these developing countries, these urban places are going to be the key to economic development. Can they make the most out of this manufacturing reliability? Can they develop partnerships with the world cities, further economic development? But hopefully not at the cost of individuals, hopefully not at the cost of poor standards of living. So let's have a look at the character of megacities in the developing world. We've looked at the nature of them, what are they? We looked a little bit at spatial distribution, we'll come back to that shortly. But what characterizes megacities? One thing I've said is that a megacity in the developing world is a feast for the senses. Visually, it's overwhelming. You've got all sorts of colours, you've got moving vehicles, you've got movement, you've got busyness. It's a feast for the ears, busy, it's noisy. If we think back to some of the writings that Charles Dickens wrote about the Victorian London, when it was experiencing rapid growth through industrialization, talked about the overwhelming noise. So these cities of our developing nations are noisy. We see traffic, we hear construction, we hear movement, we hear lots of people talking, noise, noise, noise. And of course, megacities of the developing world are a feast, an overwhelming feast for that sense of smell. When you've got poor infrastructure, poor sewage, unfortunately, you might have some issues with smell. So the Great Stink of London back in the 1850s, that was, I guess, an example of poor sewage infrastructure. Some of these large cities of the developing world can't cope with the amount of effluent. So of course we see open sewers, and when we look at challenges, there's so much related to that regarding health and sanitation. So of course they're dependent upon our world cities, but also they function, like I said before, in that manufacturing role. They are also centres of the economy for developing countries. So as it says here, they're simultaneously nationally dominant but also dependent. Many are former colonial cities, so we've got post-colonial countries that have obviously been affected by this process of colonialisation, or colonisation rather, and it's about these nations figuring out how they can best function after colonialism. And also, as I said before, they attract cheap labour services for your big T&Cs. Okay, they suffer from the effects of over-urbanisation. You've got the development of slums on the outskirts of these cities as thousands of people by the day flock to these megacities. There's insufficient tax revenue because of the informal economy. So that means public infrastructure is quite poor, traffic congestion, poor sewage, limited access to fresh water. Got shanty towns and slums, obviously people making informal settlements. There's limited planning because it just can't take place. These things are established before any authorities have the opportunity to undertake any type of proper urban planning. There's widespread pollution, and that's related back to the poor infrastructure. Lack of organisation upon the behalf of the city councils. There's social division and unrest. There might be particular social groups in close proximity, crime because of a poorly functioning police system, and of course you've got your health issues related back to the living standards in these overcrowded cities. So these are some of the persistent issues that will emerge and are emerging, and that we will look more at when we look at challenges in megacities. But climate change particularly is going to be a big issue, and we'll see more and more people flock to cities as agriculture becomes more and more difficult. So I thought we'd just have a look at a couple of megacities. I just took a quick snapshot. So here we see Sao Paulo, which is in Brazil, obviously very large urban area. So not always are these megacities dominated by your slum-like conditions, but of course you still have some challenges. So we see Karachi in Pakistan, dense population, obviously continued urbanization in Pakistan as with many other countries. We see Dhaka in Bangladesh, perfect example of rapid urbanization, one of the most densely populated cities globally. Lagos in Nigeria, rapidly growing city, megacity of Africa. And Manila of the Philippines. We have some very famous recollections maybe of the rubbish pickers of Manila and the surrounding areas, people who have moved to the city with opportunities or with the hope of opportunities, but for some it means having to sort through other people's rubbish just to survive. Okay, what I'd like you to do in reflection upon this, if you were to use some adjectives to describe some of these megacities, what sort of words would you use? I want you to log on to the Wordle website and create a word cloud based upon megacities and some of the adjectives used to describe the character and nature of megacities.